Something strange is happening in America right now. It doesn't look like a sudden collapse. There's not a single day when everything is broken. On the contrary, the system continues to work externally. People still go to work. The shops are still open. Headlines still talk about sustainability. But if you look closer, there is a feeling that the country lives in two realities at once. In one, everything is tolerable. In the other, everything became noticeably fragile. And to feel the difference, you don't need to read the reports. It is enough to stop in the parking lot at the usual shopping center, see the neat paper "store closing" on the glass, and "for lease" next to it, and understand that this street begins to sound quieter than before. Silence is generally the main sound of such periods. Not a siren, don't panic, not the bread queue. And the silence is where the usual noise used to be. Fewer cars, fewer bags in your hands, fewer people who just stopped by to watch. And this was just the economy. Because the real economy does not live in high-profile decisions. It lives on in the millions of small actions that people do when they have a supply. When you have an extra 10 minutes, an extra $20, extra energy. The most dangerous thing in such periods is that they do not frighten you sharply. They're exhausting. They make life a constant adjustment. Not, we are on the verge of disaster, but we are constantly under pressure. And it almost always starts with one thing that people rarely put into words, but feel perfectly in their bodies. The financial margin disappears. This is the zone between we live and we're starting to fall behind. Because margin is not a luxury. Margin is an opportunity to be a person, not an accountant. This is an opportunity not to think about every little thing. This is an opportunity to say yes spontaneously and not just no rationally. When the margin is there, an unexpected bill is an annoyance. When there is no margin, an unexpected invoice is the solution. What to pay for now? What to transfer? What to close with a credit card? That we'll figure it out later. And when millions of families live like this, the economy can look normal in reports and at the same time become brittle in real life. Imagine the simplest frame. The family opens the bank's app on Sunday evening. The salary has arrived, and for a second there is a sense of relief. But it lasts exactly until you see that the money has already been distributed by the system. Auto receipts are displayed on the screen. Insurance, communal apartment, telephone, payment for the car, kindergarten, subscriptions that you promised yourself you'd cancel but didn't cancel because they only support a small part of your daily life. Then you get a notification. Your insurance is being extended, the new payment is higher. Not twice, not dramatic, just higher. And this is enough to make my head click. This month will be crowded again. This is what the new reality looks like. And in close quarters, people change. They become more precise, careful, and hard on themselves. They begin to live as if they are constantly being tested for their stamina. And most importantly, this test comes not from one big event but from constant small pressure. The pressure doesn't break right away. It erases. Let's start with the most noticeable signal that many people see, but underestimate. These are not necessarily bankruptcies, not necessarily loud statements. This is the gradual disappearance of normalcy from the streets. Network after network optimizes, closes points, leaves weak locations, and leaves behind empty storefronts. And here it is important to understand. Not only the store is being closed, the habit is being closed. The route is being closed. A small piece of life is being closed. By the end of 2025, major publications have already recorded that hundreds of closures are planned for 2026, and we are not talking about any one sector, but about a broad pullback in retail, which stretches from 2024 to 2025 to 2026. For example, closure plans apply to both department stores and grocery retail. Macy's announced a course to close a significant part of stores before the end of 2026, Kroger closing dozens of unprofitable outlets in the near future. And an important detail. Companies almost always explain this rationally. Efficiency. Focus on the best locations. Transferring resources online. It doesn't sound like a panic. It sounds like management. But for districts, the consequences do not look like management. They look like the disappearance of work nearby, the disappearance of traffic, the disappearance of small businesses around. Because a shopping center is not just a store, it's an ecosystem. This is a coffee shop that lives off the flow. This is a barber shop. This is a small phone repair shop. This is a kiosk where people bought small items. These are working shifts of teenagers and students. This is the feeling that the area is alive. When one big outlet leaves, it takes more than just sales with it. It takes away the density. People often think that closures are just a change of habits. Everyone's gone online. Partially, yes, but the problem goes deeper. When physical retail shrinks, it does so unevenly. The best neighborhoods remain. Weak areas lose storefronts, services, and jobs. And this is where the chain starts, which is easy to see if you walk down the street. An empty store is not just an empty lease. It's a quieter parking lot. This means fewer people near the entrance. This is a weaker nearby cafe. This means fewer shifts for cashiers and warehouse workers. This means less money in the local economy. And this is another small blow to the financial margins of families who already live denser than they would like. Now, add to that one thing that is rarely said. When a neighborhood loses stores, it loses convenience. And convenience is the currency. Because convenience saves time, saves gas, saves energy. When convenience disappears, people start driving further. And it seems to be a small thing. Well, let's go to another supermarket. But then you notice that "let's go" is already a plan. This is already an extra hour. This is too much fatigue. And in a tight economy, fatigue is not an emotion, it is a limitation. People aren't just cutting back on purchases, they shorten your life. They do less unnecessary actions. They meet less frequently. They walk less. Fewer decisions are made. A small U-turn is appropriate here, which keeps your attention focused. Closing the store is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of another one. Because not only trade changes further, the habit changes, the rhythm changes, and what the city can afford is changing. Now add a second layer. A labor market that looks generally normal, but is getting jittery inside. One of the most significant markers of the end of 2025 is not that everyone is out of work, but that companies are increasingly cutting costs and rebuilding staff, and employees are beginning to feel that stability has become conditional. And here's an important difference. Conditional stability is when you have a job, but you don't feel supported, when the salary is available but you are not sure that it will be the same in 6 months, when the contract is renewed, but you can hear it in the air. Let's look at the budget. When you don't quit, not because you like it, but because you're afraid to change. In official figures, you can see a moderate picture, but in the actual announcements of employers about cuts is quite different. The Challenger, Gray, and Christmas report for the end of 2025 records that employers announced 1,206,374 layoffs in 2025. It also shows that the reasons are repeated: business unit closures, economic conditions, and restructurings. And separately, a very modern motive: AI as the stated reason for some of the cuts. And here's a paradox that holds the viewer back because it's recognizable. Many office workers are still employed. They were not included in the unemployment statistics. But the market feels different. A relatively stable job turns into a job that is better not to lose. Companies have pauses in hiring. Interview processes are becoming more complex. More hold position appears. But the most interesting thing is the psychological side. People begin to live as if every step should be justified. They stop changing jobs for the sake of growth. They start holding on to the place for safety's sake. They settle for a smaller raise. They tolerate toxic leadership. They do not require it because the thought sounds inside, the main thing is not to become superfluous. And it changes the economy more than one layoff. Because the economy slows down not only when people are laid off. It slows down when people stop believing that the next step will be safe. Not because they are lazy or pessimistic, but because the sense of risk has become closer than before. This is a white-collar alert. It doesn't always make headlines, but it changes the behavior, and behavior changes demand, and demand changes everything else. Now, for the third layer that makes the story particularly strong, housing. Because housing is always not only an economy, but also a psychology. Housing is an anchor, and when the anchor becomes too heavy, the whole family system starts to work worse. At the end of January 2026, another paradox appears. Mortgage rates in the United States have indeed fallen significantly lower than a year ago and are holding near the lows for several years. According to Freddie Mac, the 30-year fixed rate was around 6.1% at the end of January 2026. But even this is key. The housing market still remains in a prolonged weakness that stretches from 2022. High prices, a shortage of supply, and a huge part of families are still written out of the opportunity to buy. Even small bid movements don't bring back the sense of availability. And here it is important to make one mini disclosure, because this is exactly the moment when the numbers calm down. But reality does not calm down. The rate is not housing. The bid is only part of the payment. A person opens a mortgage calculator, enters the price of a house, and sees the final payment. And this payment still looks like a serious commitment. But then the second psychological calculator turns on in my head. And if I get cut? And if the clock is cut? And if the insurance goes up again? And if the car is being repaired? And if the child needs something expensive? And at this point, the mortgage ceases to be a dream. It becomes a risk. And there's also one thing that makes housing particularly painful right now. People see prices. They see that the price of the house looks like a figure from another life. And even if you can theoretically delay the payment, you still have the question, why do I need such a load if I'm not sure about the future? This isn't about math. It's about trust. When confidence in the future declines, even good conditions don't look good. And how do we see this in real human behavior? It's very simple. Even with interest rate movements, demand for loans does not react as it did in healthy times. Mortgage applications were down about 8.5% week-on-week for the week ending January 23, 2026, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. That is, people don't rush to buy just because the bid is slightly better. They hesitate, they count, they're waiting. This is not a panic behavior. This is the behavior of caution in a system with thin safety margins. Now, let's bring these layers together. Retail is being curtailed unevenly. The labor market is nervous, even without an official disaster. Housing remains unaffordable for many, even as the rate eases. What makes this combination truly dangerous? That it puts millions of families in maintenance rather than growth mode. And here it is necessary to say more harshly, but honestly. Maintenance. This is when your life ceases to be a project. It becomes a service. You don't make plans. You serve obligations. You don't expand your life. You're holding her in place. You don't think, what's next? You're thinking, how to make it. And here comes the fourth layer, the quietest but most important, credit. When a family's margin disappears, the credit card becomes not a convenience, but a buffer. Not, I bought it and then paid for it, and I'm closing the hole. This transition is almost always invisible in the moment. First, it's once, then until the next paycheck. Then we'll close it when it gets easier. Then the minimum payment habit appears. Then the thought, the main thing is not to delay, appears. And here's what makes this phase tricky. Life really goes on. Coffee is bought, products are purchased, the car is moving, children grow up. But the price of this normalcy is growing dependence on debt and increasing sensitivity to any shock. And here it is important to add one more detail that makes the picture more voluminous. A loan during such periods becomes not only a financial instrument, it becomes a psychological anesthetic, because it allows you not to feel pain right away. It takes her to the future, and when millions of people carry pain into the future becomes harder for the entire system. The Federal Reserve in its consumer credit releases shows that the total volume of consumer credit remains huge, and revolving credit, primarily credit cards, remains a key mechanism for short-term household flexibility. Even if the pace changes in some months, the system itself relies on credit as part of everyday reality. And here it is important not to turn everything into a horror story. If you look at the aggregate figures for credit card delinquencies for commercial banks, they don't look like an apocalypse right now. For example, according to Fred, the indicator was around 2.98% in Q3 2025, and in previous quarters it fluctuated around. But that doesn't mean all is well. This means that the system is still holding up. And when the system runs on thin margins, its main threat is not the current level of delinquencies. The main threat is how quickly ordinary families lose the ability to repay even small blows without debt. And here's a question that holds the viewer back because it's honest. If all this is true, why doesn't the word crisis appear in the headlines? Because a crisis is a moment, and what is happening now is more like a process that can be described in one word: risk reallocation. Previously, the risk was somewhere in the system. Households are now increasingly at risk on whether the family budget can withstand another increase in insurance, another car repair, another month when there are fewer hours at work, another refusal to raise wages. And that's why people are starting to live more cautiously. Caution is often referred to as choice. But in 2026, this is no longer a choice for many. This is the mode. A mode where you can't afford to make a mistake. And when millions of people can't afford to make a mistake, the country is different. Not in one day, gradually. And here it is important to take the next step. Because when the risk moves to the family level, it never remains only in the family. It starts to change its behavior, and cities are starting to change their behavior. It almost always happens the same way. At first, people become more cautious. Then they start putting off unnecessary spending. Then they start to fix themselves what they used to give to specialists. Then they start going out less often, updating things less often, and making decisions that create life rather than maintain it less often. And it sounds like a personal choice. But when it becomes massive, it's not personal anymore. This becomes an economic signal. Imagine one more shot. My neighbor used to have an air conditioning technician who came over the next day. Now the record is for 2 weeks because the wizard is looking for orders in other areas where they still pay. Or vice versa. The master is free because people have started, "For now, we will be patient." This is a small scene. But from such scenes, a new map of the country is built. And that's why retail closures aren't just about retail. This is a marker that in some places the system has already switched from growth mode to compression mode. When a store leaves the neighborhood, it takes more than just jobs. It takes away normal traffic and the feeling that the place is alive. And the feeling of a living place, this is what keeps small businesses around. This is what keeps people from thinking, maybe it's time to leave. And this is what keeps the value of the area not on paper, but in real attractiveness. Then the quietest stage begins. Almost no one notices it because it doesn't look like an event. It looks like slightly worse than it was. A little less hours of work, slightly less staff. The queue is slightly longer, slightly worse service, a little more annoyance. And almost everywhere the same language appears. "I'm sorry, everyone is like this now. We have reduced shifts. We have frozen hiring. Prices have increased. We can't do anything." This is not a dramatic conversation. This is a background conversation. but it is the background that changes the mood of the country. At the family level, this looks like a constant micro-loss of comfort. What used to be solved with one call is now solved with 3. What used to be done on the way now requires a separate exit. What used to cost adequately now requires comparing prices and thinking, maybe not yet. And here's where a strange thing happens. People start counting more than just money. They start counting energy. Should I go? Should I contact you? Is it worth arguing? And when people start saving energy, they become less patient, less sociable, less engaged. They go less to places that create a sense of community. They are less involved in the life of the area. And this is no longer an economy in the usual sense. This is the social temperature. Now, let's expand this logic to the city level. Because the city is not just about houses and roads. The city is the speed of reaction. This is cleanliness. This is lighting. This is a patrol. This is pit repair. These are libraries. These are mugs. These are the little things that make normality normal. And these things cost money. And money from cities is not taken out of thin air. They are taken from the activity. When activity slows down, the authorities first try to pull through without pain. They postpone projects, reschedule repairs. They cut costs where it is not immediately visible. They freeze hiring, and it seems reasonable. But then the second stage begins, and it is already noticeable. Services start to get worse. Roads take longer to be repaired. Services take longer to respond. The infrastructure looks worse. And at some point, people start saying not. It's expensive to live, but everything around us has become worse. And this worse is the most dangerous marker. Because worse isn't always associated with a single digit. It is associated with the feeling that the world around you has become less reliable. At this point, there is often a phrase that people pronounce almost the same in different states. It began to feel unsafe. And here it is important to be honest. Security is a complex topic. It depends on statistics, on the media, and on what areas you see every day. But there is one aspect that is almost always true in such periods. When people have less margin and more stress, social friction increases. Patience becomes less. Conflicts are becoming more frequent. Minor offenses are becoming more visible. Not because everyone's suddenly bad, but because the environment has become more tense. And this is where the effect begins, which accelerates the flow of problems between states and cities. People start comparing, not by ideology, not by politics. And for 3 very simple things: the cost of living, the sense of security, and the availability of work. And if one of these 3 components breaks down, the family begins to think about moving. At first, it is a dream. Then it's Plan B. Then it's we are really discussing. And this is one of the most powerful psychological switches in the economy, because moving is a recognition that the old stability is no longer guaranteed. But here's what's important. Migration doesn't start with a desire for a better life. It starts with a desire to be more predictable. People aren't always looking for wealth. They often look for budget control. And when the control goes away, they are willing to give up their familiar surroundings in order to feel again that life is subject to them, and not to bills. Imagine what this solution looks like in reality. It doesn't sound like romance. It sounds like a table, rent, insurance, taxes, gasoline, kindergarten, food, utilities, distance to work, school, district security. And suddenly a person starts thinking about things that he didn't think about at all before. He begins to evaluate not where I like, but where I can survive without constant anxiety. And when a lot of people start thinking this way, it changes the map of the country without a single loud statement. Now, let's go back to housing, because housing is the center stage in this story. And here's what many people don't understand. Housing affordability isn't just about the price of a home and the bid. It's also about trusting the future. When people believe that their income is stable, they are willing to commit. When they are in doubt, they may not make up their minds even if the rate is reduced. And if demand remains sluggish, the housing market enters a sticky state. Prices don't necessarily fall dramatically, but transactions slow down, expectations rise, and tensions build up. This stickiness creates a jam effect for everyone at once. Customers can't log in, sellers don't want to give up, those who are sitting on the old low rates don't want to move, and traffic becomes expensive. And when traffic becomes expensive, the economy loses its flexibility. Because flexibility is the ability of people to change jobs, move, and start over. And this is what makes it possible to survive difficult periods in a healthy system. Then another paradox almost always increases. It becomes more difficult for people to get out of the situation through changing jobs or moving, because any changes require money, time, and confidence. And it is these three things that are becoming less. Therefore, many people remain in place. Even if the place has become worse, they save money, they tolerate it, they're holding on. And this immobility, massive and quiet, makes the economy less flexible. A less flexible economy is less likely to survive shocks. And here comes the most unpleasant question for 2026, which people rarely say out loud but often feel. If life has become more expensive and the margin is smaller, what will happen at the first real blow? Not with raise the price of insurance. And when you hit the level of job loss, serious illness, divorce, accident, a sharp increase in payments. Because a system where people hold on without margin can look stable for a long time. But it becomes extremely sensitive to events that in normal times would be difficult but relatable. And here it is important to say one thing that makes this period especially insidious. In such years, people almost always try to find one reason, one guilty person, one word that explains everything, because it's easier for the brain. If there is one reason, then there is one button. And if there is only one button, then you can expect one solution. But reality is different. There is no single button here. There's a system here where each pressure reinforces the other, and that's why everything feels so exhausting. Not scary, tedious. And in this sense, 2026 is not the year of collapse. This is a year when America is increasingly divided into two speeds, for those who still have a margin of safety, and for those who have it almost no longer. For those who can wait it out, and for those who have to constantly adjust. Those who make choices out of desire, and those who make choices out of necessity. And the most important thing is not a moral assessment. It's not what use, someone smarter, someone dumber. This is the result of an environment where basic costs have become heavier and flexibility has become more expensive. When we talk about store closures, labor market caution, or housing being stuck, we're really talking about the same thing, a loss of traffic. The system still works, but it doesn't move people up much better. Worse gives you the opportunity to start over. Worse allows you to make mistakes without punishment. And when the system makes mistakes worse, people become more cautious. And caution closes the circle. And here there is one landmark that almost always separates the unpleasant period from the dangerous period. It becomes dangerous when even a small blow ceases to be bearable. Not all of them. But enough people have it to start changing their behavior massively. And that's exactly what we see. Less decisions, less confidence, less movement, more holding a position. It doesn't look like a one-day disaster, but this is exactly what economic fragility looks like in real life. Now, let's fix this so that the viewer is left with not a feeling, but a structure. Because good videos in this niche don't just tell the story. They give a person a way to look at the world differently. The first signal is not official inflation. The first signal is margin in everyday situations. People are increasingly saying, "It won't work out this month." Plans are being rescheduled more and more often. More and more often choose cheaper, even if it is worse. And most importantly, they are increasingly comparing not brands, but the amounts in the basket. The second signal is local business as a barometer, not large networks, small ones, how long they work, how many employees, how often discounts are applied, how often is closed earlier, how often is rented out. This is an indicator that the flow of money in the area has slowed down. The third signal is the labor market as a sense of speed. Not the unemployment rate, but how quickly you get hired. The number of interview stages. How often the position was frozen. How long people have been looking for work. And the most important thing is how ready people are to change jobs. If people stop changing, then the fear is growing. The fourth signal is housing not by price, but by activity. How many ads are hanging for a long time? How much withdrawn from sale and then reappeared? How many incentives and discounts there are? The market can be expensive, but if there is little activity, it means not strength, but tension. And when you put these signals together, you start to see not a panic picture, but a structure. You begin to understand why in 2026 many people feel tired even with seemingly normal headlines. Because the problem isn't just one metric. The problem is that the margins of families have become thinner, which means that any change is felt more strongly. And here is the final thought that puts an end to it and at the same time makes a bridge to the continuation. 2026 is not the year of one big event. This is the year when the country changes through a million small decisions. Someone decides not to buy. Someone decides not to move. Someone decides not to change jobs. Someone decides we will be patient for now. And it is from these small decisions that the big map of change is assembled. So the question I want to leave to you is simple. What has changed the most where you live? Housing, work, or the cost of living normally? Write in the comments. I read everything because it is in these observations that the reality of these reports is seen. And if you want to continue, the next part will be about what happens when credit finally ceases to be a convenience and becomes a survival infrastructure, and why exactly this is changing markets and cities faster than any big news story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.